We're traveling along in the Embracing the Love of God book by James Bryan Smith, and this was Jim's first book, and he said to me that he would probably do a lot of things differently with it today, but I love the concept because some of you have heard me say that this basic message of embracing the love of God is what makes Christianity most distinctive. And we tend to forget that. Compared to every other religion on planet Earth, what makes Christianity most unique is our proclamation that God is love. Not that God is loving, that God has loving tendencies, occasionally being above and beyond loving. No, that God is love. It's the only religion on planet Earth that proclaims that. So today, we're at chapter 7 in the book, where we're going to look at experiencing God's care. Now, one of the reasons why I love this book is because it is so basic. And I don't know about you, but I know very well about me. I have to go back to the basics over and over and over again because I have sacred memory loss. I forget the things I need to remember. And in my humanity, I remember the things I need to forget. Now, I know that's not your issue. I'm just being open and honest with you today. So there's a book that's been fascinating to me by Reynolds Price that basically asks the question, does God exist and does God care? And it's a powerful book, and I want you to hear a quote from a medical doctor who wrote to Reynolds and said, I've been diagnosed with cancer. I'm in my mid-30s. I just started practicing medicine. I just finished my residency, and I've been given a terminal life sentence. I'm only going to live a matter of hopefully 4 years and maybe only 2. And this is what he said to Reynolds. I want to believe in a God who cares because I may meet him sooner than I had expected. I think I'm at the point where I can accept the existence of God, but I can't yet believe that God cares about me. Now, that young medical doctor whose first name is Jim speaks for a lot of people. I'm wrestling with the existence of God, but I'm pretty certain I just don't believe that God cares about me. Now, if that is not your issue, thanks be to God, go across the street to Cheddar's and have a good brunch. But I think if we're honest, every single one of us at some point in our lives is going to have that wrestling issue. Does God really care about me? So in our gospel lesson today that Pastor Ben read, what were the disciples asking Jesus? Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? Do you not care? Now, that's not a new question. It's not only our question, it's the question of old, because when the children of Israel were led out of slavery from Egypt into the promised land, on their journey toward the promised land, they're getting hungry and thirsty, and what do they say? Is the Lord among us or not? They had only been out 3 days. 3 days. And they're asking the question, is the Lord among us or not? So let me ask you, when's the last time that you cried out, Lord, do you care? When's the last time you uttered silently or aloud, Lord, are you among us or not? When's the last time you found yourself pleading with God, where are you? A young man said to me the other day, I just don't have any issues with this whole idea of God's love and God's care and God's compassion. And I said, that's wonderful, but if you live long enough, you will. When's the last time you felt abandoned by God? Now, I need to remind you, as I'm reminding myself, even Mother Teresa spent most of her life in the wilderness of her soul. That's what this book is about. She was declared a saint by Pope Francis, and when you look at this book, her private writings, she's crying out, "Where are you? Lord, I don't understand why you don't care about me. Why have you abandoned me?" Over and over and over. And she spent the most number of years of her religious life living in the wilderness. So this isn't about, if only I were more spiritual, then I wouldn't have these feelings or these thoughts or these experiences. Now, are you all with me this morning? I took track of what people have said to me over the last 3 months, and these are the questions I've heard people say. Okay, God, where are you? My family's falling apart. Okay, God, where are you? I've lost my job and I don't know how to make ends meet. God, where are you? My child is dying of cancer. God, where are you? My marriage is in shambles. God, where are you? I'm feeling lonely. God, where are you in the midst of my suicidal thoughts? Now that's from our community. From people who call Chapel Hill their spiritual home. And I would ask you, when is the last time that you cried out to God for one reason or another, and what would you put in the blank? What's the reason for crying out? Where are you? Have you abandoned me? Now again, I want to remind you, this is not just our issue. It's not a 21st century problem. It's a humanity issue, a human problem. It's something we've all been wrestling with, like the psalmist. Why am I discouraged? Why am I restless? Why, I ask myself, are you so depressed? Why are you so upset inside? Now, let me say something just to make sure I have your attention. If you have never been here, there's a good chance you've been living your life in denial. And you know what denial stands for? Don't even know I am lying. So, now that I've depressed you, hopefully not, we have this scripture that Pastor Ben read, cast your anxiety on God because God cares for you. Now, when I'm with people as a pastor in their time of desperation, when they're in the wilderness of their lives, I find more often than not that people say, this is a really good idea, this is a great concept, I love the theory, it's incredibly wise, but I just don't have a clue as to how to do that. Give me the formula. Spirituality never has formulas. And if somebody gives you a formula, don't buy into it. It's a little bit like the man who wrote me a letter, some of you have heard me say this, that said that Chapel Hill received a gift of several $1 million. Now, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. So don't buy into the formulas, but what does it mean to live into cast your anxiety on God because God cares for you? How do we do that? So the question of the day is, how do we experience God's care? And I think first we have to look at what are the blocks. What keeps us from practicing this? Not that, this. So I've been looking very carefully at 1 Peter chapter 5 that Pastor Ben read. And for the sake of time, we're not going to read it again. But I want you to know what I've come up with. And as I'm preaching, I'm always giving you opinions that you may or may not agree with, and that's okay. But I want you to know what I've come up with this week. The opposite of humility is not pride, according to Peter. Well, if the opposite of humility is not pride, what is it? The opposite of humility is anxiety, according to Peter. Now, I'm not talking about anxiety disorders. That's over here. I'm talking about what's here, and that is the ordinary experiences of life that create for anxiety. Here's what Peter says, in my opinion. The opposite of humility is not pride. The opposite of humility is anxiety, because anxiety leads to cynicism, and cynicism leads to more anxiety. And when I look at what's happening in the writings of Peter, and I look at what's happening in our day, the point of intersection is that I have come to believe in my life, and maybe in yours, that I've become way too cynical. And the reason I've become so cynical is because I'm too anxious. And anxiety and cynicism feed off each other. And according to Peter, you may or may not agree with him, but he's entitled to his opinion too, right? According to Peter, what's at the heart of it all is pride. Now, let's just do a quick test to see how cynical you are. I am more curious than I used to be, true or false? Second question. I believe the best about people. Third question. I rarely worry that new people I meet will hurt me. Fourth question. I'm more open than I used to be to new ideas. Fifth question, I have no trouble listening deeply before I offer my opinion. Number 6, I feel happy and sad in the appropriate situations. Number 7, I believe my best days are ahead of me. Number 8, helping others encourages me because I know that I'm making a difference. Now, this test that I've given you is all over the internet, testing people's cynicism level. And I have to confess to you that I am much more cynical than I thought. I flunked the test. I'm a self-avowed practicing cynic. Am I the only one? And when I thought about it from Peter's perspective, as my anxiety has risen over all the things that we face in our world today, then my cynicism rises at an equal level. And it becomes a block to my ability to let God be God and to do what Peter says is to cast my anxiety onto God because God cares about me. So here's the thing. Are you still with me? When you look at the gospel lesson today, I want you to look at the block within the disciples. Oops, that's the wrong scripture. I'll come to it here. That's the problem with this technology. It's a blessing most of the time, right? More importantly, I'm the one with the problem. It's easy to blame the technology. But so Jesus takes them on this journey. The storm arises. You heard the story. Jesus is taking a good long nap. And I want to remind you of a painting from Rembrandt, one of his most famous paintings of this story, and he's trying to capture what's going on with the sea. This was not, we have some white caps. This was not, I think there's a storm moving in. This was that. And Jesus is taking a nap. And what does Jesus say to them? After he calms the storm, he said to them, "Why are you afraid?" A better translation is, "Why are you anxious?" And the New Revised Standard Version says, "Have you still no faith?" And this is something that's unique to Mark's gospel. We read from Mark's gospel. I love Mark's gospel. It's the Reader's Digest version of the gospels. It's the shortest. It's the most powerful. It's the most poignant. I love other gospels. But if you want to cut to the chase, read Mark. And Mark 27 times, I counted them, 27 times shows the disciples as experiencing a block in their ability to trust God. And that's why the question, have you still no faith? That question is asked 27 times and how many times? If you don't learn anything else today, you can go home and say, I learned that 27 times in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus is asking this question. And a better translation from the original Greek is, are you still without understanding? You still don't get it. Over and over and over, Jesus is frustrated because of the disciples' block to trust. Jesus calming the storm was easy. Calming the disciples, another issue. Now, Mark is very unique. I know you're ready for the solutions. How do we cope with these blocks? What was Jesus doing with the disciples? Well, let's get back into the story. On that day, when evening had come, Jesus said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." Now, in the Gospels, there are code words. And this is one of them. Do you know what it means? Every time Jesus says, "We're going to the other side," that was his way of saying, you better buckle up because I have something to teach you. He used it repeatedly. It was his way of saying, get ready. Well, they didn't get it. They didn't pick up on the code. And he says, we're going across to the other side, and this is the most interesting thing. And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And other boats were with him. Now, Mark, you see, is the most concise of all the gospel writers. There's not fluff, there's not extra words, but he sure added these words, and he's the only one who did. This story is also found in Matthew and Luke, and they don't add this. That means that he wants us to hear something. What does he mean when he says, and leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was? What does that mean? Does that mean that they just decided to accept Jesus with his long hair and his white robe and just accept him just as he was? I'll never forget when I was in high school, my mother was the chair of the school board for many years, 27 to be exact, and matches the 27 inches. That's why I thought of it. So I'll never forget the family who came to the school board meeting one Monday night because their son had been kicked out of school because he violated the dress code with his hair being too long. Now, Montana has some interesting rules, one of which is if your hair is beyond your collar, you cannot come to school. At least our school district. So he grew out his hair and he came to school and he was kicked out. And the parents, I'll never forget this, came to the school board meeting, and they were protesting the rule that he had to have shorter hair. And the father, Mr. Bailey, Wayne to be exact, Wayne Bailey stood up there and said, Mrs. Gannon, I am protesting this rule because if Jesus can have long hair, my son can have long hair. And how dare you bar my son from an education, because if Jesus were here, would you bar him from an education? Now, is that what we're talking about here? Is that what Mark's getting into? Is Jesus, he had long hair. Just accept him as he was. Is that what we're dealing with here? You're a tough crowd this morning. Just as he was. Other boats were with him. Who cares? What's this about, Mark? Oh, Mark has something up his sleeve. Come back next Sunday and I'll tell you what it is. No, I wouldn't do that to you. Well, guess what? This is where the English, translating from Greek to English, just lets us down in so many ways. And this is another example, because what Mark communicates repeatedly, he doesn't do anything on accident. It's all very intentional. And he's saying, I hope that you never forget that Jesus is going before you. He's inviting them to the other side. And who's the first one in the boat? Jesus. He's sitting there waiting for them. You say, okay, that's kind of interesting. What's the big deal about that? Are you ready? The big deal about that, as Mark says, the reason we can trust the God of the universe is because he demonstrates in Jesus that he's always one step ahead. He's always going before. No matter where you go in the next hour or the next day or the next month or the next year, Jesus is already there. So if you have a doctor's appointment tomorrow and you're scared to death, when you walk into that room, there will already be a mysterious presence. Who's already there. And some of you in your cynicism may say, well, Jeff, I think that's a stretch. Well, let me just prove my point with just one passage. The day of resurrection. When they entered the tomb, they saw a young man clothed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and the women were shocked. But the angel said, don't be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth who is crucified. He isn't here. He is risen from the dead. Look, this is where they laid his body, and here it is. You ready for this? Now go and tell his disciples, including Peter, that Jesus is going ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there just as he told you before he died. Mark, over and over and over, is proclaiming the Jesus who goes before. You may be in the courtroom tomorrow. Jesus is already there. You may be having a birthday party tomorrow, and it might be a really awesome celebration, and Jesus is already there. Now you're wondering, why did he say and other boats were with him? What's the point? Oh, this is so powerful. If only I could preach it well. Mark is preoccupied with this notion that Jesus goes before, and he's also preoccupied with this notion that Jesus knows you, Lorinda, and he chooses to get in your boat. That's Mark's way of saying that. There are all these other boats. He went to the boat that belonged to the disciples, the boat that they would travel in, and Mark is trying to communicate that Jesus is intimate and personal and knows us by name and by need. And that's what the disciples couldn't get. And that's why they couldn't trust. And that's precisely the reason Jesus could take a nap. His anxiety was low. Their anxiety was high. I reread the Gospel of Mark, and every time I found the disciples being cynical, I circled it. I lost track of how many times. And the challenge for you and me is to believe that our cynicism is rooted in our inability to trust. Chris Shallon shared this quote with me. I love this. Another Bible scholar, Walter Brueggemann. Being comfortable, or being comforted rather, by the presence of God is an alternative to our quest for being comfortable. Being comforted by the presence of God is an alternative to our quest for being comfortable. And I love that quote because the disciples' journey is all about being comfortable rather than being comforted. They thought they were on their own. Jesus, you're a good idea. Jesus, we gave up our lives to follow you, but we don't know that we can trust you. And I think that's where so many of us live. Luke puts it this way: Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies? Yet not one of them is forgotten in God's sight. But even the hairs of your head are all counted. So do not be anxious. You are of more value than many sparrows. Let's have some time for silent prayer and reflection.